A single whisper can unlock a door no one knew existed. The morning light spilled through the diner windows like melted gold, catching in the steam that rose from a dozen cups of black coffee. It was the kind of place where the same regulars ordered the same breakfast, where time itself seemed content to hum softly under the buzz of fluorescent lights. Emily Rhodes had worked this corner booth for 15 years. She'd seen countless faces, truckers, teachers, tourists, but never men like the two sitting at table 7 that morning. The younger one, crisp white shirt and a pen poised above a contract, had the kind of nervous energy that came before signing your life away. Across from him sat the older man in a charcoal suit, still as a statue, radiating the quiet certainty of someone used to winning. Emily set down the coffee pot, her reflection trembling in the surface of the document between them. She didn't mean to read, but her eyes caught the name printed in bold at the top: Calder Holdings, LLC. Her breath faltered. She had seen that name before, burned into every notice that had driven her husband's small company into the ground 20 years ago. The younger man lifted his pen. The tip hovered just above the line. The older man watched, lips curved in something like approval. Emily's throat tightened. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of ink and hot coffee. She leaned in, her voice barely more than a breath. "Sir, don't sign this." The pen froze. The entire diner seemed to stop breathing. The man in the white shirt turned, confusion flickering in his eyes. The other, the billionaire, Mr. Calder, shifted slowly, his gaze cutting through her like a blade. "Excuse me?" he said, the words smooth but edged. Emily straightened, her apron trembling against her knees. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's just, I've seen that name before." Calder's stare hardened. "You have no idea what this is about." But she did. Not every detail, not the numbers and clauses, but the feeling of it, the same chill that had filled her home the day the foreclosure letter arrived. The same company, the same logo, the same predatory calm. The young man looked between them, his hand still frozen mid-air. "What's going on?" he asked. Emily forced herself to meet his eyes. "Sometimes the wrong signature can ruin more than a business," she said softly. "It can ruin a life." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that presses against your ribs and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Calder's jaw tightened. He reached for his coffee instead of replying, the cup clinking against its saucer. Emily stepped back, her pulse roaring in her ears. She didn't know what had just begun, only that a line had been drawn, invisible but irreversible, across the small wooden table. Outside, the morning looked the same. But inside the diner, something had shifted. The rest of the morning bled into a haze of half-served coffee and unanswered questions. Emily tried to focus on refilling sugar jars and wiping counters, but the memory of the billionaire's stare clung to her skin like static. The diner had quieted after that moment. Even the regulars sensed something had shifted, as though her whisper had disturbed the order of things that were never meant to change. When the two men finally left, their untouched plates sat like evidence, one smeared with egg yolk, the other clean, deliberate, perfectly empty. Through the window, she watched them walk to a black sedan that gleamed against the pale sky, and she could not shake the feeling that the world inside that car would never be kind to men who listened to waitresses. That night, the sound of rain on the roof of her small apartment blurred with the hiss of frying oil from the diner's kitchen still echoing in her head. The city beyond her window pulsed with the indifferent rhythm of neon and sirens, but her mind replayed the single look Mr. Calder had given her, the cold recognition of someone who did not like to be challenged by the help. She sat at her kitchen table, the same wobbly table she had salvaged from her husband's old office before the bankruptcy auction. The drawer still held a stack of documents yellowed by time, and when she opened them, the smell of dust and failure rose like a ghost. There it was again, the name printed across the header, Calder Holdings, LLC. The same ornate C, the same address downtown. The contract had been the first domino in the collapse that had taken her husband's business, his health, and eventually his life. Her fingers traced the ink as though touching it could change the past. She remembered the day he had signed his hand shaking, the pen heavy with hope he did not truly believe in. They had been promised partnership, not absorption, mentorship, not erasure. Within months, everything he had built was gone, sold off in pieces, until even his name on the front door had been replaced. Emily closed the drawer, her pulse steadying into something that felt like resolve. Maybe warning that young man today had been foolish, but silence had cost her too much already. She could not bear to watch another person step into the same trap. The next morning, she took the early bus into the city, clutching a paper bag of old receipts and a single photograph of her husband standing in front of the company sign. The building, she remembered, had been replaced by a glass tower, sleek and mirrored, its lobby smelling of money and disinfectant. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, perhaps confirmation, perhaps punishment. The receptionist, all sharp angles and polite indifference, told her Mr. Calder was out of the country. It was a lie. She could tell by the flicker in the woman's eyes. But she only nodded and left, feeling the chill of air conditioning chase her to the revolving door. Outside, she stopped by a newspaper stand and stared at the headlines until her reflection blurred among them. Somewhere behind her, a voice called her name. It was the younger man from the diner, David Hale. He looked different without the suit jacket, almost human, his sleeves rolled up, his expression uncertain. "I've been looking for you," he said. "You were right. That contract wasn't what it seemed." He told her about the late-night calls, the missing pages, the fine print that turned partnership into liquidation. He had confronted Calder, who dismissed him with the same calm cruelty she knew too well. "How did you know?" he asked, and the question carried more weight than curiosity. It was a plea for understanding. Emily hesitated, then handed him one of the old receipts, the ink faded but the name clear. "Because he did it before," she said. "To my husband." They sat on a bench beneath the awning as rain began again, soft and persistent. The city blurred behind a curtain of water, cars moving like ghosts. David read the document, his jaw tightening as the pattern revealed itself, the same shell company, the same legal phrasing, the same promise of partnership. "He's been repeating the scam for decades," Emily said quietly. "Every time someone signs, he takes what's left and disappears behind another name." David stared at the paper for a long time before speaking. "Then we stop him," he said, not with the arrogance of a man used to winning, but with the weary conviction of someone who had finally seen the cost of silence. When he left, Emily walked home through the rain, feeling neither victory nor fear, only the strange calm that follows truth. The diner's neon sign flickered at the end of the block, humming like a pulse in the dark. Tomorrow she would return to pouring coffee, to polite smiles and endless refills, but something essential had changed. Somewhere in a glass tower, a man like Calder would begin to wonder how a whisper from a waitress had reached his doorstep. And in that wondering, the first crack would appear in the wall of his certainty. Emily closed her umbrella, stepped into the warm glow of the diner, and knew that the story wasn't finished, it had only just begun. 3 days passed before the quiet rhythm of Emily's life began to feel wrong again. The diner had returned to its steady hum, the regulars had reclaimed their booths, and yet the moment she whispered those 3 words still seemed to echo between the clinking cups and the hiss of the coffee machine. She had told herself that warning the man had been enough, that the truth had already started its slow crawl toward daylight. But when she saw a black car idling outside across the street that afternoon, windows tinted darker than the law allowed, a cold certainty gathered in her chest. Power never forgot the voice that challenged it. It only waited for the right time to strike back. The first visit came from a man in a navy suit, too polished to be a customer. He sat at the counter, ordered black coffee he never touched, and watched her work without speaking. When he finally left, there was a folded napkin beside the cup with a single line written in neat mechanical handwriting, "You should have stayed quiet." Emily read it twice before crumpling it into her apron. The next day, the diner owner called her into the back office, his voice heavy with unease. "We've had complaints," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Big clients, important people. Maybe take a few weeks off, just until this blows over." It wasn't a request. She handed over her apron, nodded once, and walked out into the sharp chill of late afternoon. The sky above the city looked colorless, as if it too had been drained by something unseen. That evening she returned to the small apartment, pulled the curtains tight, and spread the documents across her kitchen table once more. The old receipts, her husband's letters, the photo of the company building these had been relics of grief before, but now they looked like evidence. Her fingers trembled as she traced the identical signatures, the way the same notary stamp appeared across decades. Each paper carried a faint pattern of betrayal that linked the past to the present. She understood now that Calder's empire wasn't built on innovation or insight, it was built on erasure, on the silent collapse of those who trusted him. She thought of David Hale, the man she had warned, and wondered whether he had already become the next name erased from the ledger. But David hadn't disappeared. That night her phone rang once, twice, then fell silent. When she finally answered, his voice came through low and urgent. "You were right," he said. "He's hiding everything. Fake subsidiaries, ghost accounts. I found a file with your husband's company listed in it." Emily's breath caught. "Then you have proof," she said. "Proof won't matter," he replied, "not unless someone's willing to show it." He asked to meet the next morning at a small park near the river, a quiet place where the noise of traffic faded into the rustle of trees. When she arrived, he was already there, coat collar up, a briefcase on the bench beside him. Inside were copies of contracts, payment records, and a list of companies that had all met the same fate as her husband's. Together they traced the lines, realizing how meticulously Calder had recycled his own crimes under new names. "He's turned fraud into an art form," David said, bitterness lacing his tone, "and no one ever questions him because no one wants to lose access to power." Emily looked at the rising sun glinting off the water and felt a strange peace settle over her exhaustion. "You asked me once how I knew," she said softly. "It's because I used to believe in people like him." For a moment they sat in silence, the sound of gulls overhead cutting through the morning stillness. Then David closed the briefcase, his decision made. "If I go public, he'll destroy me," he said. "But if I stay silent, I'm him." It was not bravado, but resignation, the sound of someone stepping across an invisible line. That evening, as the city lights flickered on one by one, Emily walked past the diner where she had once spent half her life. Through the window she could see another waitress, younger, laughing at something a customer said. The sight felt like a memory from someone else's life. She turned away, heading toward the bus stop, when headlights swept across the pavement. The same black car was there again, engine idling, exhaust curling into the cold. A man stepped out, not Calder, but another suit, expressionless, efficient. "Miss Rhodes," he said quietly, "you're making a mistake." She met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm correcting one." The man said nothing else, only stepped aside as she walked past him, her reflection sliding across the glossy surface of the car like a ghost. That night, David uploaded the documents. Within hours, the files spread faster than anyone could contain, leaping across message boards, legal blogs, and the inboxes of journalists who had once written glowing profiles of Calder's genius. By dawn, the story had broken. Billionaire's empire, built on shell companies and broken promises. Emily read the headline from her kitchen window, the same window where she had once watched foreclosure notices being nailed to her door. The irony did not feel like victory, only closure. The phone rang again, a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, a familiar voice spoke, slow and measured. "You think you've done something brave," Calder said, "but all you've done is make yourself visible." Emily looked at the growing light outside, at the sun slicing through the gray clouds, and smiled faintly. "Maybe that's all I ever wanted," she said, and hung up. The city was still waking as she stepped outside, the air sharp and clean after the night's storm. For the first time in years, she felt weightless, not safe, not untouchable, but unburdened. Somewhere across town, Calder's lawyers were scrambling, his empire trembling under the weight of truth. She walked toward the diner, the place where everything had begun, and as the doorbell chimed, she caught her own reflection in the window. The woman staring back was older, lined with loss, but her eyes were steady, the color of morning after rain. She took a deep breath, picked up a coffee pot, and began again. The scandal unfolded faster than anyone could have predicted, rippling through the city's skyline like a storm cloud swallowing sunlight. By mid-morning, every financial channel had Calder's name flashing across its ticker, every talk show host speculating on his fall from grace, and every investor scrambling to distance themselves from the man once hailed as an industry savior. Emily watched the coverage from the diner counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The words on the screen: fraud, corruption, shell companies, were almost too heavy to process, yet each one carried a strange weight of justice. Around her, the regulars whispered, trading theories and fragments of disbelief, but no one noticed the quiet woman in the corner whose whisper had started it all. She should have felt vindicated, but all she felt was an odd, hollow ache, like the silence that follows thunder. Redemption, she realized, was rarely triumphant. It was the soft aftermath, the stillness that demanded reflection. That evening, as the diner emptied and the neon sign hummed against the window, she found David waiting outside, coat unbuttoned, exhaustion written in every line of his face. He looked both older and lighter, the burden of complicity finally scraped from his conscience. "They froze his accounts," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of traffic. "There will be hearings, investigations, maybe even prison." He paused before meeting her eyes. "But they're calling me a whistleblower. I'm not sure I deserve that." Emily smiled faintly, the kind of smile built from too many sleepless nights. "Truth doesn't care who speaks it first," she said. "Only that someone finally does." They walked together down the wet sidewalk, their reflections stretching and merging under the streetlights, two figures bound not by victory but by survival. When they reached the corner, David stopped, glancing toward the flashing cameras clustered near the courthouse steps. "They'll want you to testify," he said softly. "They'll want the woman who warned him." The thought unsettled her. For decades, she had built her life on invisibility, surviving by blending into the background, by keeping her head down and her words small. Now the world wanted her name, her face, her story. "What if I don't want to be the face of it?" she asked. "Then don't," he replied, his tone steady. "You already did the hardest part." He turned away then, disappearing into the crowd of reporters, his silhouette swallowed by the flicker of camera lights. Emily stood for a long moment, letting the rain collect on her lashes, then turned back toward the diner, drawn by the comfort of routine. The next morning brought a new kind of quiet, the kind that comes after chaos when the world is still catching its breath. A letter had been slid under her door, no return address, the envelope thick and heavy. Inside was a single page typed on fine paper, bearing Calder's signature and a short message. "You've won nothing. The world forgets quickly." There was no anger in the words, only weary arrogance, the echo of a man still convinced of his own permanence. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with her husband's papers, where it would serve as a bookend to an era now finished. As weeks passed, the story consumed the city, but Emily stayed away from the noise. The diner reopened under new management, and though the booths and jukebox were the same, something about the air had shifted. Customers greeted her with unfamiliar warmth. The regular who never left tips now did. Even the owner, once curt and preoccupied, made a point to ask how she was doing. The world hadn't changed completely, but it had tilted just enough for decency to slip back into fashion. One afternoon, she received a letter written in neat, deliberate handwriting, David's. Inside was a photograph of a small office being rebuilt, the sign above its door reading Hale and Rhodes Consulting. Beneath it he had written, "For people who still believe in honest work." She stared at the picture for a long time, her throat tightening with something she could not name. Perhaps it was pride, or grief, or the strange realization that even small voices could reshape destiny. That evening she walked along the Hudson, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. The skyline shimmered in the distance, the tallest buildings catching the last gold light of the setting Sunday. Somewhere in those towers, Men like Calder were recalculating, adjusting, waiting for the next opportunity. Power never truly vanished, it only changed its disguise. But Emily understood now that truth worked the same way. It could lie dormant for years, then reappear in a whisper, a receipt, a moment of courage from someone who had nothing left to lose. When she reached the edge of the pier, she took the letter from her pocket, the one with Calder's taunt, and tore it into thin strips that fluttered away on the wind like pale confetti. "The world forgets quickly," she murmured, watching the pieces vanish into the dark water. "But not everyone." Her reflection rippled across the surface, older, lined, yet somehow unbreakable. She turned back toward the city lights, their glow reflected in her eyes, and began the slow walk home. Behind her, the water carried the paper fragments downstream, scattering them among the lights of the bridges, where they would dissolve quietly, leaving no trace but a story that had already begun to outlive them all. Winter came early that year, sliding into the city with the kind of quiet that erases sound before it reaches the ground. The diner's windows fogged with every exhale of steam, and Emily found comfort in the familiar rhythm of pouring coffee, wiping counters, and listening to the low murmur of strangers sharing their small sorrows. It had been months since Calder's empire collapsed, and yet his presence lingered like a stain that no news cycle could completely scrub away. Each morning brought another article, another headline about asset seizures, frozen accounts, and former allies now testifying against him. Emily didn't read them anymore. She didn't need to. The truth had already done its work, leaving behind the delicate wreckage of justice fulfilled and innocence reclaimed. But justice rarely ends neatly. One evening, just after closing, she noticed an envelope tucked beneath the diner door. No name, no address, only her initials scrawled in blue ink. Inside was a single photograph, her walking home in the rain, unaware, her figure framed beneath the glow of a streetlight. There was no message, only the image itself, proof that someone had been watching. For a long moment, she stood frozen by the counter, her reflection doubling in the window as the city lights flickered behind her. Then she quietly folded the photograph, placed it in her pocket, and turned off the lights. Fear had visited her too many times in life to find a home here again. The next morning she took the early train to the edge of the city where the old Calder estate sat behind iron gates and sleeping gardens. Reporters had camped there for weeks before growing bored, leaving behind cigarette butts and the ghosts of unanswered questions. She walked past the guards, who barely looked up from their phones, her diner uniform covered by a long gray coat, her hair tucked beneath a scarf. The mansion was silent except for the faint sound of classical music leaking from an open window, soft as regret. Inside, Calder sat in a wheelchair near the fire, his once commanding posture reduced to something fragile and human. His eyes found her instantly, not surprised, not angry, merely tired. "I wondered when you'd come," he said, his voice gravel-edged and slow. Emily hesitated near the doorway, the warmth of the room pressing against her cold skin. "I'm not here for revenge," she replied. "Then why?" he asked, almost curious. "Because you sent someone to follow me," she said, placing the photograph on the table between them. He studied it for a long time, the faintest smile curling at the edge of his mouth. "You took something from me?" he murmured. "People like me don't forgive easily." She met his gaze evenly. "People like you never learn until there's nothing left to lose." He laughed, a dry, brittle sound that belonged to a man haunted by echoes of power. "You think truth changes men?" he asked. "Truth only humiliates them." She took a slow breath, her fingers tightening on the strap of her purse. "Maybe," she said, "but sometimes humiliation is all that's left between guilt and redemption." The fire cracked softly, throwing orange light across his face, and for a moment she saw the man. He used to be the ambition, the intellect, the arrogance that once fooled an entire world. He turned away, staring into the flames. "They took everything," he whispered. "The company, the houses, the friends, all gone." Emily's voice softened. "You built your empire on other people's ruin. What did you expect to stand when the foundation crumbled?" He didn't answer, but his silence was louder than any denial. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small tin of sugar cookies wrapped in wax paper. "You used to come to my husband's office years ago," she said quietly. "He always saved one of these for you. You never remembered him, but he remembered you." She placed the tin on the table beside the photograph and turned to leave. Behind her, Calder's voice trembled not with power, but with something dangerously close to remorse. "Does it make you feel better?" he asked. She paused at the door, the faint smell of smoke and age clinging to the air. "No," she said after a moment, "it just makes it real." Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft flakes catching in her hair as she walked back through the gardens. Each step left a clean mark on the unbroken white, proof of passage, and nothing more. By the time she reached the gates, the first rays of sunrise cut through the clouds, washing the mansion in pale gold. She didn't look back. Some ghosts, she knew, vanished only when you stopped acknowledging their presence. The train ride home was long and quiet, the landscape flashing by in muted colors, fields, warehouses, the skeletal outlines of winter trees. Somewhere between stations, she closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the rails lull her into something like peace. When she returned to the city, the diner was just opening. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, and the jukebox hummed softly in the corner. A young waitress greeted her with a shy smile and handed her an envelope left by a messenger earlier that morning. Inside was a check with no sender name, only a note written in precise handwriting for rebuilding what power tried to destroy. The amount was enough to pay off her debts, enough to keep the diner afloat for years. She folded the note carefully, placed it in the register, and poured herself a cup of coffee. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet redemption playing out inside a small corner cafe. As she watched the snow swirl beyond the window, Emily realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act, but a long accumulation of small mercies, an old recipe passed from one broken generation to the next. Somewhere, in a house too large for one man, Calder would eat a sugar cookie and remember the warmth of a world he had traded for power. And somewhere, in a diner filled with laughter and steam, a woman who once whispered, "Don't sign this," would learn that even whispers can echo long enough to rewrite the ending. Spring arrived late that year, creeping into the city as if afraid of being noticed, bringing warmth only in hesitant bursts between long gray rains. The diner's front windows glowed faintly against the dull sky, reflecting the slow rhythm of ordinary lives returning to their small routines. Emily had begun to move through her days with a calm steadiness, each gesture deliberate and measured, the soft clink of plates, the smell of butter melting on toast, the sound of doors opening and closing like gentle punctuation marks in a story finally learning how to breathe. The scandal that once consumed the city had drifted into the past, replaced by newer controversies, fresher tragedies, and louder voices. Yet beneath that surface noise, something subtler had begun to shift, something she felt in the way strangers met each other's eyes with a little more patience, in the way customers said thank you and meant it. She had not seen Calder again, though rumors circulated about his health, his isolation, and the legal appeals that now stretched into months of quiet bureaucracy. Occasionally, a journalist would stop by, hoping for a quote or a glimpse of the waitress whose whisper had unmade an empire, but Emily always declined gently, smiling the way only someone tired of their own story can smile. The truth had already been told. Anything more would have been indulgence. Instead, she poured her attention into the diner, repainting the walls a soft cream, reupholstering the booths in red vinyl, and planting a line of geraniums outside that caught the sunlight each morning. The regulars teased her for caring too much about appearances, but she understood that beauty, even small beauty, was a form of defiance against the ugliness she had survived. One afternoon, as she was refilling the sugar dispensers, the bell above the door chimed and David Hale stepped inside. He looked different, lighter, cleaner somehow, like a man who had finally stopped running from his conscience. He ordered coffee, black, and waited until the rush had thinned before speaking. "He's dying," he said softly. Emily froze, the spoon halfway between her fingers and the counter. "Heart failure," David continued. "He's in hospice. No family left. He asked for you." For a long moment she didn't move. The words hung in the air like dust in sunlight, fragile and almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore. That evening she took the bus across the bridge to the hospice center that sat quietly on the outskirts of the city. The halls smelled faintly of antiseptic and lilacs, and the nurses moved with the gentle efficiency of people who had long learned how to carry silence without breaking it. Calder's room was small, the curtains drawn halfway, the sound of a monitor marking the slow rhythm of his failing heart. When she entered, he opened his eyes with surprising clarity, as though he had been waiting. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice thin but steady. She sat beside the bed, unsure of what to feel. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're the only one who ever told me the truth," he replied, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. For a while they said nothing, listening instead to the distant hum of the evening shift and the soft rain tapping against the window. Calder's hand trembled slightly as he reached for a folder on the nightstand and pushed it toward her. Inside were documents, deeds, account transfers, and a final statement signed in unsteady handwriting. "It's everything that's left," he murmured. "The diner, your husband's old company, a few small businesses I took apart. They're yours now if you want them." Emily looked down at the papers, then back at him, and felt an unexpected surge of pity. Power had shrunk him to the size of his regrets. "You can't buy forgiveness," she said quietly. "I'm not trying to," he answered. "I'm just trying to leave something that isn't poisoned." She stayed with him until night deepened, talking not about crimes or justice, but about small things: music, the smell of rain, the strange peace that comes with knowing the end has finally arrived. When he drifted into sleep, she stood, folding the folder against her chest. On her way out, the nurse at the desk stopped her and handed her a sealed envelope. "He wrote this yesterday," the nurse said. "Said you'd understand." Inside was a short note in the same trembling handwriting. "I built everything on silence. You broke it. Thank you for the noise." Weeks later, when Calder's obituary appeared in the paper, it was brief and without embellishment, a summary of dates and numbers that failed to capture the quiet implosion of a man who had once held cities in his palm. Emily didn't attend the funeral. There was none to attend. Instead, she opened the folder he had left her and spent the next several months contacting the families of those who had lost everything to his deceit. Piece by piece, she returned what could be returned, sometimes only a fraction, sometimes more. Most people cried. Some refused. A few simply stared at her in disbelief. But each act, however small, felt like lifting another stone from a grave she had carried in her chest for decades. One evening, as she locked up the diner, she noticed the sunset reflected across the windows of the building across the street, the glass burning gold against the darkening sky. She thought of Calder's final words. Thank you for the noise, and realized he had meant something larger than apology. Truth, she understood now, was not quiet. It was the persistent hum of conscience that refused to die. She looked down the empty street, the neon sign flickering to life above her, and smiled. In the fading light, her reflection shimmered faintly on the glass. Tired, lined, but unbroken, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that redemption was not a miracle reserved for the powerful, but a slow, ordinary mercy earned one whisper at a time. The box of papers sat untouched on Emily's kitchen table for nearly a week before she found the courage to open it again. Each evening she would pass by it, the corner catching the lamplight like a quiet question she wasn't yet ready to answer. She had thought that returning Calder's stolen assets to others would bring peace. But peace, she discovered, had its own kind of restlessness. The folder contained more than deeds and receipts. It held fragments of lives she had never met, stories frozen at the moment they were betrayed. One file in particular drew her eye, a faded contract signed 25 years ago, with her husband's name scrawled beside Calder's. The ink had browned, the edges curled, and her husband's careful handwriting looked strangely alive, as if it were still reaching towards something unfinished. That night, the air outside was thick with the smell of rain, and the city hummed with a restless energy that always came before a storm. Emily sat by the table, tracing the signature with trembling fingers, and felt herself pulled backward through time. The memory came not as a single flash, but as a slow unfolding. Her husband, Daniel, standing in his workshop surrounded by blueprints and the low whir of machines, his face lit by the fragile hope of a man who still believed in fairness. He had worked for months designing a new energy system that promised efficiency and sustainability, something he hoped would change lives rather than exploit them. When Calder approached him with an offer to partner, Daniel had refused twice, wary of the man's reputation. But ambition and exhaustion are close cousins, and by the third meeting he had convinced himself that compromise was simply another form of progress. Emily remembered the day of the signing, clearly the gray light through the office blinds, the coffee gone cold, and Calder's smile as polished as the pen he handed across the table. Daniel's hand had trembled slightly before the ink touched paper, a hesitation that might have saved them both if only it had lasted a second longer. In that moment, she had sensed something she could not name, a silence too deliberate, a courtesy too smooth, and when she reached out to squeeze her husband's hand, he had smiled at her, trusting that the world was still capable of mercy. Within months, the company was gone, swallowed whole by Calder's firm, its patents transferred, its debts multiplied beyond recognition. She remembered the nights that followed, the unpaid bills, the phone calls, the quiet shame that lived in his eyes as he tried to fix what could not be fixed. The sound of thunder pulled her back to the present, her hands clenched around the edge of the contract. The paper felt fragile, yet defiant, like something that refused to disappear. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to remember the night Daniel died. The apartment had been cold, their heat long disconnected, and he had stayed late at the desk, going over old invoices, trying to find a way through numbers that no longer added up. She had woken to the sound of the chair falling, his body crumpled beside it, his heart surrendering to a burden it was never meant to carry. In the weeks that followed, she had drifted through grief like a ghost, numb to everything but survival, holding on to her silence as if it were the only thing left that still belonged to her. Now, sitting in the same apartment decades later, Emily realized how deeply that silence had rooted itself inside her, shaping every decision, every avoidance, every carefully measured breath. It was Calder's real legacy, not wealth or ruin, but the quiet fear he left behind in those he destroyed. She looked again at the contract, at Daniel's looping signature beside Calder's, and felt the old guilt twist into something new: determination. She could not change the past, but perhaps she could reclaim it, not through vengeance or restitution, but through remembrance. The dead deserved witnesses as much as the living deserved justice. The next morning she carried the folder to the diner, placing it on the counter beside the coffee machine. The regulars watched curiously as she laid out the documents, spreading them like pieces of a map that led nowhere but truth. When David arrived later that afternoon, she showed him the contract and told him everything: the meetings, the promises, the collapse, the night her husband's heart gave out under the weight of betrayal. He listened without interruption, his expression grave but soft, and when she finished, he said, "You've carried this alone long enough." He suggested holding a small memorial, not for Calder or his victims, but for the people who had disappeared between the lines of his empire, the forgotten workers, the families who never got their names in the papers. A week later, they gathered on the roof of the diner at sunset, a handful of strangers bound by loss and coincidence. Each brought something small, a photo, a letter, a receipt, and placed it into a wooden box that David had built. Emily added the contract, folded carefully, and a photograph of Daniel smiling beside the workshop door. As the sky turned copper and violet, she lit a single match and held it above the open box. "For every name that vanished," she said quietly, "for every life that deserved to be remembered." The flame caught quickly, curling the paper into embers that drifted upward, glowing briefly before fading into the wind. As they watched the ashes rise, Emily felt something inside her loosen, the years of silence unraveling like a thread pulled free from a seam. The faces around her blurred in the fading light, and for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to cry not with despair, but with release. The past no longer felt like a weight pressing against her chest. It felt like a story finally allowed to end. When the fire burned out, they stood for a while in the gathering dark, saying nothing, listening only to the faint hum of the city below. The wind carried the last of the ashes out over the river, scattering them into the night. Emily looked down at her hands, the faint soot marks black against her skin, and thought of Daniel, of the life they might have lived, and of the whisper that had changed everything. For the first time, she didn't feel haunted by it. She felt free. The weeks that followed the rooftop memorial unfolded with a fragile calm, as if the city itself were exhaling after a long season of holding its breath. The story of Calder's downfall had faded from the news, replaced by fresher scandals and newer faces, but for those whose lives he had quietly dismantled, the ripples still lingered. Emily had grown used to the silence that comes after justice, a silence that felt neither peaceful nor empty, but watchful, as though the world were waiting to see whether truth could survive without being buried again. She filled her days with small acts of order, restoring the diner's rhythm, tending the flowers that bloomed unevenly outside, and learning to let conversations end without the need to explain herself. The quiet suited her, at least until the morning the letter arrived, postmarked from Washington, and sealed with a corporate insignia that made her blood run cold. It was not from Calder, he was gone now, but from the legal firm that had once represented him, now operating under a new name with a new roster of executives pretending not to notice the shadow hanging over their glossy offices. The letter was polite, almost friendly, requesting a meeting of mutual interest regarding the remaining holdings Calder had transferred before his death. Emily read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it beside her cup. She knew what it meant. Power, even when wounded, had a way of reassembling itself. There were always new Calders waiting to inherit the ruins left behind by the old ones. That night she called David, who had moved his small firm into a second-floor office overlooking the Hudson. "They want to buy silence again," she said. He hesitated before replying. "Then we won't sell it." They met the following afternoon in a narrow conference room that smelled faintly of dust and ambition. The representatives from the firm were young, sharp-suited, and too confident, their smiles carefully practiced to conceal contempt. "We admire your moral resolve," one of them began, sliding a folder across the table. "But some matters are best concluded quietly. A donation to your diner fund, perhaps, in exchange for your cooperation." Emily looked at the figure written on the paper, an amount large enough to rebuild her life twice over. For a long moment she said nothing, tracing the edge of the folder with one finger, hearing the echo of her own whisper years ago. "Don't sign this." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with the same old temptation disguised as generosity. Then she pushed the paper back across the table. "You think kindness can be bought?" she said evenly. "But kindness is what keeps people like you from falling apart." The younger man's smile faltered, replaced by the irritation of someone unused to hearing no. David leaned forward, his tone calm but sharp. "You're not dealing with a witness," he said. "You're dealing with a survivor, and survivors don't settle." The silence that followed was almost cinematic, the kind that makes people aware of their own breathing. When the meeting ended, the representatives left with tight smiles and briefcases full of unspoken threats. Emily and David walked out into the late afternoon sun, the river glinting behind them like a sheet of moving glass. "They won't give up," he said quietly. She nodded. "Neither will we." End quote. That night she sat at her kitchen table again, the folder of letters and contracts open before her, and realized that the war Calder had begun was not his alone. The machinery of exploitation did not die with one man. It merely changed names, polished its face, and waited for the next opportunity. But there was comfort, too, in understanding the shape of that truth. Knowing the pattern meant she could see it coming and stop it sooner. The next morning she began gathering others, the people she and David had helped over the past year, small business owners, former employees, single mothers, teachers, all of them carrying some invisible scar left by someone else's greed. They met in the diner after hours, their conversations soft but steady, their purpose clear. What began as a circle of the wounded slowly became something stronger, a coalition built on refusal, on the stubborn belief that decency could be organized. Word spread quietly, through phone calls and letters, until the diner's back booth became a sanctuary for the unheard. Lawyers volunteered time, journalists offered to publish stories anonymously, and soon a movement without a name began to take form. They didn't march or shout, they simply refused to disappear. One evening, David stood beside the counter watching as Emily poured coffee for a young man whose family had just recovered their lost savings. "You know," he said, "this place feels less like a diner and more like a courtroom now." Emily smiled faintly, setting the cup down. "Maybe that's what justice looks like when it stops pretending to be grand," she replied. Outside, spring rain fell in fine silver threads, washing the streets clean enough to reflect the glow of the city's lights. Through the window, Emily could see her own reflection overlapping with those of the people inside: workers, teachers, dreamers, each of them carrying something heavy, each of them refusing to set it down. It was a strange, beautiful sight, fragile but real. She thought of Calder then, not with anger, but with clarity, understanding that his greatest mistake had never been greed, it had been believing that people forget. The world forgets headlines, but not humanity. As the night deepened, the last customers left, and the diner grew still. Emily turned off the lights, leaving only the neon sign glowing in the window, its reflection stretching across the wet pavement like a promise. The whisper that had once changed everything had become something larger, a hum that refused to fade, a current of quiet defiance running through the veins of an ordinary city. Power, she knew, would rise again in another form, another name, but so would truth. And when it did, someone, somewhere, would be ready to speak, perhaps even in a voice softer than hers. She locked the door, slipped her keys into her pocket, and stepped out into the rain. Her figure reflected in every puddle she passed, a silhouette of persistence moving steadily through the glimmering dark. The summer heat came heavy and strange that year, settling over the city like a fever that refused to break, and the air inside the diner grew thick with the scent of coffee and ambition. What had begun as a whisper of resistance had now turned into something unmistakable, a current of quiet courage that pulled people from the corners of their own exhaustion. Emily could feel it in the rhythm of her days, in the soft murmurs of strangers who came not just for food, but for a kind of unseen fellowship, in the way the regulars spoke about fairness, as though it were something tangible, something they might one day hold in their hands. The diner had become both a refuge and a symbol, a small bright pulse of defiance in a world still learning how to listen. By mid-July, the coalition had grown far beyond her imagination. Reporters had started to circle again, this time with respect rather than curiosity, writing pieces about the Second Chance Diner, as if it were the heart of a moral awakening. David handled most of the attention, his firm expanding cautiously but deliberately, while Emily stayed behind the counter, anchoring the movement in the quiet dignity of work. Yet, beneath the surface of all that progress, an unease had begun to build. The same corporations they had exposed were shifting shape again, merging into new names, rebranding themselves as saviors of reform. It was Calder's legacy reborn, different faces, same hunger. Emily knew the pattern too well to mistake it for coincidence. The first sign of danger came in a letter slid under the diner door one night, written in precise, elegant handwriting. "You've made your point. End it before someone else decides to finish it for you." It was unsigned, but its civility chilled her more than any threat could. She showed it to David the next morning, his face tightening as he read. "They're testing your fear," he said. "They want to see if silence still works." Emily folded the letter and slipped it into her apron pocket. "Then we won't give them the satisfaction," she said, though a tremor lingered behind her calm. Days later, the tension grew more tangible. Cars idled too long outside the diner, Unfamiliar faces lingered at the counter, their questions too polished, their smiles too flat. One evening, as she locked up alone, a man stepped from the shadows near the alleyway. He was young, dressed neatly, the kind of man who might pass unnoticed anywhere. "You should stop talking," he said, his tone almost polite. "Some things are too expensive to expose." Emily looked at him steadily, her hand on the doorframe. "Then maybe you should stop hiding," she replied. For a moment neither moved, and then he turned and disappeared into the night as silently as he had come. That night she couldn't sleep. The city's noises, sirens, laughter, the occasional car horn felt sharper than usual, and the shadows in her apartment seemed to shift with their own intentions. On the table lay a stack of reports David had sent over, exposing yet another shell company tied to Calder's former network. Each document was another wound reopened, another reminder that justice, once awakened, was never satisfied with half-truths. She read until dawn, the words blurring into patterns of greed and deceit, and when the first light broke through her window, she understood what had to be done. She called David early that morning. "If we wait for someone else to act, this all starts again," she said. "Then we finish it," he replied. They arranged a meeting with a group of investigative journalists who had followed the case from the beginning. It took place in a borrowed community hall, its walls lined with faded posters about union rights and lost causes. The room filled slowly, teachers, workers, small business owners, all carrying the quiet dignity of people who had learned not to expect miracles but had shown up anyway. Emily stood before them, her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady as she spoke. "We started with one whisper," she said, "and that whisper became a voice. But truth dies if we stop speaking. Calder's world still breathes through those who took his place, and if we let it grow again, everything we've built becomes memory." Her words were not grand, but they carried the kind of conviction that could make even tired hearts stir. When she finished, the room fell silent, the weight of collective understanding pressing against the walls. One by one, the attendees signed their names to a statement, a public demand for reform, for transparency, for laws that would make it harder for greed to hide behind bureaucracy. They would publish it under the banner of the Whisper Network, a name David had chosen in tribute to the moment that had started it all. Within a week, the statement went viral. News outlets picked it up, social media flooded with stories of ordinary people reclaiming their dignity, and politicians, some reluctantly, others opportunistically, pledged support. The same corporations that had tried to intimidate her now faced audits and investigations, their pristine facades beginning to crack under scrutiny. Yet even as the movement gained momentum, Emily felt the same dissonance she had known from the beginning. Justice always came with a shadow of loss. She walked through the diner that evening, the noise of laughter and conversation blending with the sound of rain against the windows, and thought of Daniel, of Calder, of every name written and erased across decades of power. When she closed up for the night, she lingered at the door, watching the city lights shimmer across the wet pavement. Somewhere, in the high towers of glass and steel, the powerful were already plotting their next reinvention, certain that people would forget again. But Emily knew better now. Forgetting was a luxury the honest could no longer afford. She turned off the diner sign, the hum fading into silence, and stepped outside. The air smelled of rain and electricity, a storm waiting to break. As she walked home, her reflection followed her in every puddle, older, slower, but unyielding, and for the first time she felt not like a survivor but like a beginning. By early autumn, the world had grown loud again, a chaos of voices arguing over what justice truly meant and who had the right to claim it. The Whisper Network had taken on a life of its own, stretching beyond the diner, beyond the city, beyond even Emily's understanding. What began as one act of defiance, a single whisper in a room of silence, had become a movement with teeth, one that both inspired and unsettled those who benefited from forgetting. The press called her the Waitress who rewrote the balance of power, though she disliked the title, finding it hollow and theatrical. She hadn't rewritten anything, she had simply refused to stay quiet. Still, the narrative was no longer hers to control. Justice, once set in motion, had its own momentum, and she could only hope it remembered where it came from. The diner remained her anchor amid the noise. Every morning she opened the doors before sunrise, the smell of coffee and cinnamon cutting through the chill, the windows glowing like lanterns against the gray. Customers came not only for breakfast but for reassurance, for a reminder that something steady still existed in a world tilting toward extremes. Reporters still hovered outside, their cameras hungry for another soundbite, another quote to pin to her story, but she ignored them now, letting her actions speak where words could no longer reach. She moved through each shift with quiet precision, her hands steady, her smile faint, her eyes always watching. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the real battle was not in the headlines, but in the slow erosion of truth that came afterward, when comfort began to dull conviction. David visited less frequently these days, his work pulling him into meetings and hearings that demanded more of his time. When he did appear, it was always near closing, his face drawn from long hours of negotiation and exposure. "They're afraid of you," he told her one night, his voice low as he stirred his coffee. "Not because you destroyed anyone, but because you reminded them people still care." Emily looked at him, the flickering neon reflecting in her tired eyes. "Then maybe fear isn't such a bad thing," she said softly. "It keeps them honest, at least for a while." They both laughed quietly, though neither believed honesty could ever be permanent. It was around that time the opposition began to regroup. Anonymous articles appeared online discrediting her, twisting her story into something self-serving and cruel. Some accused her of fabricating evidence, others of exploiting sympathy for profit. Threatening letters arrived again, this time disguised as concern. "You've inspired enough," one read. "Let the world move on." But Emily didn't answer them. She had learned long ago that power always tried to reclaim its silence, dressing it in reason, wrapping it in civility. The more they spoke, the clearer she became. Their fear was the proof she needed that truth still mattered. The confrontation came quietly, not in a courtroom or a broadcast studio, but in the diner itself, as it was always meant to. It was late on a Friday evening when a small group of men in tailored suits entered, their manner deliberate, their smiles rehearsed. The leader, tall and composed, placed a folder on the counter. "We're not here to argue," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "We're here to offer a settlement. The movement has done its part. Let it rest now." Emily didn't open the folder. She didn't need to. "Rest," she repeated, the word tasting strange. "You mean forget?" The man's smile did not waver. "You can't fight forever. The world needs stability." She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady, low, and unshakable. "Stability built on silence is just another version of control. I've seen where that leads." The man sighed, closing the folder, his expression betraying a flicker of frustration. "You can't stop what's coming next," he said. "There will always be another Calder, another system, another machine." Emily nodded slowly, wiping the counter with a cloth, her movements deliberate and calm. "I know," she said, "but there will also be another Waitress." For a heartbeat, the air between them held still, thick with the unspoken recognition that neither side could truly win. Then the men turned and left, their reflections vanishing in the glass as the door swung shut behind them. When they were gone, Emily exhaled, realizing her hands were trembling. Outside, the city hummed with life, indifferent, yet somehow listening. She turned off the lights, one by one, until only the sign above the diner remained its faint glow, painting the pavement in pale gold. Sitting by the window, she thought of all that had been lost and gained, all the noise that had filled the spaces where silence used to live. She didn't know what came next, whether the movement would endure or dissolve under the weight of its own hope. What she did know was simpler and more certain. Truth had already changed its shape. It was no longer fragile, no longer hidden in whispers. It lived in every act of defiance, every refusal to sign away conscience, every person who looked power in the eye and still spoke. The next morning, the diner opened as usual. The sun broke through the clouds, bathing the street in light that felt too honest to ignore. Strangers walked past her window carrying newspapers with headlines about reform, legislation, and accountability. The world was still imperfect, still noisy, still cruel, but somewhere within that noise was a rhythm she recognized, the sound of people learning how to speak again. Emily poured herself a cup of coffee, her reflection shimmering faintly in the dark surface, and allowed herself a small smile. The war between silence and truth would never end, but for now, the balance had shifted ever so slightly toward decency, and in that fragile equilibrium, she found enough peace to keep going. Winter returned almost without warning, arriving not as a storm but as a slow, deliberate fading of warmth that crept into everything, even memory. The leaves had long since fallen, the streets dusted with a fine film of frost, and the world that once buzzed with outrage had gone quiet again. For the first time in months, Emily found herself moving through days that no longer felt like survival but something gentler, something approaching stillness. The diner had settled into its new rhythm, steady, unhurried, full of faces that carried the calm of those who had endured too much noise and finally learned the value of silence used well. She came to work before dawn each morning, the air sharp and clean, the smell of fresh coffee rising like forgiveness. It was not peace, not exactly, but it was something close enough to keep her breathing easily. She had not heard from David in weeks. His work with the reform committees had taken him across the country, from hearings to town halls, his name now attached to the movement they had sparked together. Occasionally he would send a letter, always short, always signed with the same line, "Keep the door open. People need to know there's still a place for truth." And so she did. The diner became that place, a soft shelter for the honest and the lost. Students came to write their essays there, night shift workers came to find warmth, and once in a while someone would walk in clutching an old document or a confession, eyes wide as if seeking absolution. Emily never turned them away. She had learned that redemption was not something one demanded of others, it was something quietly tended to, the way she tended to her coffee pots and her flower boxes, slow and patient and unseen. The first snow of December arrived overnight. When she stepped outside to open the diner that morning, the city looked transformed, soft, muted, every harsh edge covered in white. She stood for a moment in the cold, letting the quiet soak into her bones, and thought of the journey that had brought her here, from the whisper that changed everything to the storm that nearly consumed her. It felt distant now, like a story she had once heard but no longer owned. Yet traces of it remained everywhere: the photograph pinned near the register, the folded newspaper on the counter, the small brass plaque by the door that read Second Chance Diner, founded in memory of those who spoke when it was hardest to speak. That evening, as she wiped down the tables, she noticed a young woman sitting alone at the corner booth, a familiar look of hesitation clouding her face. The girl was barely 20, clutching a folder to her chest, her coffee untouched. Emily approached gently, recognizing the weight in her eyes, the same weight she had once carried herself. "You look like someone standing at the edge of a decision," Emily said softly. The girl blinked, startled, then nodded. "It's about my company," she whispered. "They're hiding something, numbers that don't add up. I don't know what to do." Emily poured her another cup of coffee and slid into the opposite seat. "Then start with what you know," she said. "And when you speak, don't whisper out of fear. Whisper because truth deserves to be heard gently." The girl smiled faintly, a fragile kind of courage flickering in her expression. When the girl left, the bell above the door chimed softly, and Emily watched her disappear into the snow. For a moment she felt the echo of her own younger self, the version that had once believed silence was safety. But now she understood. Silence only becomes safety when it shelters honesty, not when it hides from it. That night, as the last of the customers drifted away, she lingered by the window, her reflection layered over the falling snow outside. The world beyond looked distant, blurred, yet strangely bright. Somewhere, new voices were rising, some angry, some afraid, some uncertain, but all of them necessary. Later, as she counted the register, she found an envelope tucked beneath the till. Inside was a check written in David's handwriting, along with a note. "For expansion, truth needs more tables." She laughed softly, shaking her head, a warmth blooming in her chest. It wasn't the money that mattered, but the reminder that their work, however quiet, still moved outward, finding lives to touch she might never meet. She placed the note in the drawer beside Calder's old letter, the one that once warned her the world forgets quickly. She had kept it not as bitterness, but as proof of how wrong he'd been. The following Sunday, the diner closed early for the first time in years. Emily took the long walk to the riverfront, her boots crunching through thin layers of snow, the air cold enough to sting but clean enough to taste. The Hudson stretched before her, dark and endless, carrying reflections of the city's lights like a slow-moving constellation. She leaned against the railing, watching the current shift and swirl, and thought of Daniel, of Calder, of David, of every person whose choices had led her here. Life, she realized, wasn't about erasing what hurt, but about holding it differently, lighter, truer, as a lesson rather than a scar. A gust of wind swept through, scattering the snow in tiny spirals that glittered under the streetlights. She closed her eyes, breathing it in, and let the sound of the water fill her mind. Somewhere behind her, the city kept moving taxis, voices, the hum of power and ambition, but here, at the edge of the river, there was only the soft rhythm of her heart keeping time with the current. She smiled to herself, a small, private gesture of peace. Tomorrow, the diner would open again, the bell above the door would sing its familiar note, and another stranger would walk in carrying their own unspoken truth. And when they did, she would be there to listen, not as a savior, not as a symbol, but simply as a woman who had learned that redemption begins quietly, like the whisper of a kind word on a cold morning, and grows stronger each time someone chooses to keep it alive. The spring light returned with a tenderness that felt almost undeserved, spilling across the city like forgiveness that had taken its time arriving. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and morning coffee, and the first blossoms clung to the trees with the same quiet determination that had carried Emily through every season before this one. The diner woke slowly each day, its windows glowing with a soft gold that blurred the line between habit and hope. Inside, the rhythm was the same. The gentle clatter of dishes, the hiss of the coffee machine, but something deeper pulsed beneath it, an unspoken understanding that peace had not been given to her. She had built it, brick by quiet brick, through persistence, through kindness, through the courage to stay. A year had passed since Calder's empire had fallen, and the city had already rewritten his story in headlines and history books. They spoke of financial collapse, legal reform, and the birth of a new moral movement, but Emily knew those were only the surface truths. The real story lived here, between the tables and the counter, in the faces of people who had learned to believe again that small voices could matter. She no longer thought about victory or loss. She thought about continuity, about the fragile chain of decency that linked strangers who chose honesty when no one was watching. Some mornings, she would look out the window and see the young woman from months ago walking past on her way to work, chin lifted, eyes steady, and Emily would smile without calling out. Some lessons were meant to be carried quietly. David returned one afternoon in early April, older somehow but softer, the sharpness of his ambition tempered by gratitude. He ordered his usual black coffee, sat at the counter, and watched her work in silence for a while before speaking. "You know," he said, "they're calling the new legislation the Roads Act. I tried to change it, but they wouldn't let me." Emily laughed softly, shaking her head. "Names fade," she said. "It's what survives underneath that matters." He smiled, knowing she meant it. When he left, he pressed a small envelope into her hand. No words, no explanation. Inside was a newspaper clipping of a photograph taken at the first memorial they had held together, the smoke of burning papers curling upward into twilight. Across the corner he had written in small letters, "You kept the fire gentle, but it still burned the dark away." That night, as the last customers drifted out and the neon sign cast its soft reflection over the empty booths, Emily sat alone with the clipping, the room humming faintly with the sound of the city beyond its walls. She thought about Daniel, about Calder, about every thread of sorrow and defiance that had woven itself into this place, and she realized that the diner had become more than shelter, it had become testimony, not to power, not to victory, but to endurance. She stood, turned off the lights one by one, and stepped outside. The street was quiet, washed clean by an earlier rain. Across the glass, her reflection hovered, a woman, lined by years but lit from within by something steady and unbreakable. Above her the sign flickered once, then steadied, the words "Second Chance Diner" glowing against the dark. The air was cool, carrying the faint echo of laughter from somewhere down the block. She took a deep breath, feeling the world settle into its proper balance, flawed, fragile, and full of meaning, and began walking home, her footsteps soft against the wet pavement. Behind her, the diner stood shining in the darkness, its windows warm with the light of a place that remembered, a place where truth had once spoken in a whisper and refused ever to fade again.